Dairy competitiveness. So we've got a stream of work going on competitiveness, and it's been running as part of our work for quite a while now. So I've had contributions from a number of people over time to this area of work. But one of the first things you want to do before you charge off into the great unknown is define what you're talking about. And here's a definition we pulled together, which I think is quite useful. So the competitiveness is the ability of the dairy sector, and I think that's important. We're not just talking about farms in general, we're talking about farms, processors, and getting it to market. To offer products that meet the consumer needs of local and world markets. So getting to that, meeting the need. If it doesn't meet their need, then you're not going to be able to sell it at prices that are competitive and provide adequate returns on the resources employed or consumed in producing them. So this takes into account the, all the inputs in your production process, land, labour, other inputs. If you can't meet the market price of those and hang on to those resources, then you're not competitive in that space. And now and into the foreseeable future, because it's all very well to say where you could be super competitive today based on the current context, but if you're not set up for the future context, that's arguably even more important. So anyway, a very long-winded definition, but one that I think captures the key concepts in competitiveness. So today, though, I've narrowed the scope a little bit to talk about the farm sector. So if we think about who are our international competitors, we could, you could think of basically all the major dairy producers or dairy exporters that could fit on this list. But just for example, you might think of Ireland, a country that has a similar production process to us, pasture-based, and has been growing strongly over the last 10 years or so, certainly since quotas were released. The US, a very large producer, is to some extent involved in export markets, and again has been growing over time, but with a very different production process, largely barn-based milk. And Australia, traditionally a competitor in the international market, but perhaps less so now. So if we start with the US, they've had arguably 25 years of stability. If we look at milking cows in blue, there's basically been 9 million cows, give or take a few 100,000 for 25 years. And over that period, the milk production has been increasing at a compound annual growth rate of about 1.6%. So that looks a lot like stability. And in fact, you could go back to 1985 to the joint Australian Society of Animal Production and New Zealand Society of Animal Production conference in Australia. And there were people looking at the US then, and they were thinking about the future for the Australian dairying sector. And one of their tables in this was looking at the US, 5,000 litres per cow. And at that time, even New Zealand was beating Australia under this metric. Hard to believe, I know. And what else were they thinking about? Well, they were looking at this graph and like, Victoria, the major dairy producing region of Australia, is lagging behind the US. The US, they've got it sorted. They know what they're doing. Let's do more of that. And so to some extent they succeeded over the last 25 years, or even up to the period where this was published. The compound annual growth rate in milk per cow in Australia has been about 2%, so exceeding the growth rate in the US. But what else has happened at the same time? Total milk production in Australia hasn't changed at all, or at least in the last 25 years, and in fact is trending downwards. The number of farms, the compound annual growth rate, or I should say the rate of decline, has been 3.5% per year. And the lack of profitability in the Australian dairy sector is almost legend at this point. So it just goes to show that milk per cow is not going to solve all your problems, and letting scientists loose with the future of your dairy sector can sometimes be a dangerous thing. So back to the US. What's different there? In the US, you've got substantial economies of size. So as you go from relatively small farms, less than 200 cows, there's a fairly high cost of production there, US dollars per hundredweight of milk. And it looks like you've exploited most of the economies of size by about 750 cows. Still continues a little bit heading into that very large farm category. There is, though, still significant variation. So the lowest 25th percentile for cost is, well below the average, or the median, I should say, and the worst ones are well behind on that cost category. And what else do we know about the US? So there it is a small margin but large production system, which is virtually the opposite to New Zealand. So if we put in for this 2016, we put in the gross revenue, you can see that most of these small producers, even if you're in the top 25%, you're still going backwards. And if you're at, say, 750 cows, you've just got to be better than average. But these mega farms, if you will, once they get to, once you're up to this size, then it's really only the worst farms in that category that aren't turning a profit. So there is, this creates a pressure. So what's that doing in the US? It's driving rapid change. There's less farms, 4% less farms per year, so even more rapid change than Australia, away from traditional regions, moving away from smaller farms and away from pasture as a source of feed, because typically the smaller farms that are more pasture based, and towards higher production per cow. So if we look at the farms by the number of cows, so small in orange is farms less than 200 cows. So about 25 years ago, you can see there's over 120,000 farms, and the vast majority were small. Some medium-sized farms, and there's a pixel-wide slither, I think. Anyway, a small slice of large farms down here. And you can see what's happened. The small farms have been declining rapidly. This medium-sized category has been stable, but we've seen growth in this large farm sector. Okay, so that's in terms of the number of farms. What about the share of production? So the small farms used to have nearly a 2/3 share of production, and now it's not much more than 20%. Medium's about the same, but the large farms have gone from 10% of production to now being well over half of the production. So, a huge story of consolidation and structural change. And just for the context, 2,500 large farms in the US produce twice as much milk as all 12,000 New Zealand dairy farms. Okay, so that's just 2,500 farms in this category here, large. The western share is increasing, so this is talking to the change of where those farms are. So the traditional areas being the northeastern states of the US, places like your Wisconsin, New York State, that part of the world. So that's been declining from more than half to less than half. Other states have seen a small decline, but the West is probably the area that's seen the greatest growth. But even in the last, for example, probably 10 years, you're seeing change within the Western area, which is, there's been strong growth in California up to that point, but then with competition for water, land, and environmental regulation, then they've tended to move to other states in the West out of California.
10 minutes.
So what should New Zealand take away from this? The first lesson is don't be Australia. That wasn't a great move. Understand your competitive advantage, and we know what that looks like. It looks like high pasture harvest. It looks like low cost per hectare, and not overcapitalising, not paying too much for the assets in your business. And we explored that in the Neal and Roche paper. Okay, so if we think about those three things, pasture harvest, costs and overcapitalisation, how have we been going on those metrics? Well, the New Zealand pasture harvest has been flat over, nearly 20 years. Interestingly, you could ask who is making progress on pasture. Uruguay and Argentina have been pretty flat. At a much lower level, okay, so there's not much progress there. But, in Australia, or the Victorian part of Australia, is basically making not much in the way of progress. But Tasmania is making, quite solid progress, and South Africa has been making astounding progress over the last decade and a half. But we don't see many people talking about South Africa. Okay, what about our operating costs? Well, the first thing you'll take away from this picture is pretty much everyone's operating costs are lifting. The ones that are lifting most rapidly, places like Argentina, Uruguay and Australia. South Africa has managed to buck the trend a little bit. And if you look at New Zealand, like, hooray, we're still pretty low relative to these other suckers. And if you look at the US, you're like, okay, well, the US costs are going up at about the same rate as New Zealand. Great, we've got a margin here. Kaloo. Unfortunately, the US is closing the gap on economic costs. So by economic cost, we mean the operating cost plus the return required to the assets in that business. So, what does it cost to access the capital that you need for your business? So under this scenario, because land in New Zealand is relatively expensive, the economic cost in New Zealand is not actually far below what we see in Australia and Tasmania, where productivity is low, but also the land is cheaper. So that's a bit of a concern. And what you can see out of the US is the US, where there used to be a huge gap between these places and the US has narrowed that gap substantially. So I think that is a concern. And if you think about the top 25% of the US, they're probably getting down around this area here. So I think that should be a bit of an alarm bell. So in conclusion, I would say don't try to beat the US at their own game. The Australians had a go at that, and how did that work out for them? Not so well. Be aware of the limited milk price upside. So the US, it's not that long ago where we had an $8.40 milk price. I would suggest that the likelihood of that occurring into the future is possibly less likely. Certainly, it would never last more than a year, because the US can ramp up production on marginal milk quite rapidly. So where does our focus need to be? On our competitive advantage, pasture, costs and disciplined capital investment. So not overpaying for assets, particularly in this era of what's likely to be minimal capital growth. We do have other things that perhaps we can think about, which is, can we sell on other attributes? Can we sell on pasture fed or high animal welfare milk, or climate change neutral milk? What are our options to not compete directly against US milk in international markets? So yeah, there's a broader piece there as well. Okay, that's me.